Hello and welcome back to Politics and Polls. I'm Julian Zelizer, a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University. And this is my co-host and colleague, Sam.
Sam Wang, professor of neuroscience and molecular biology and co-founder of the Princeton Election Consortium.
So one of the most fascinating parts of this whole campaign has to do with the religious right. The religious right's been an important part of the Republican coalition since the 1970s. It's been a central part of the conservative movement, with figures like Jerry Falwell playing a very big role in the Republican mobilization that we've seen since Reagan, pushing the party on social and cultural issues. Often they've been disappointed by Republican presidents once they're in office, seeing their issues pushed aside, but they've remained central. And while they've been disappointed with other presidents, including Ronald Reagan, some think there's been no test like Donald Trump. He has tested them in terms of his personal life. He's tested them in terms of the issues that he stands for. And many evangelicals were surprised when Jerry Falwell responded to the Access Hollywood tapes by just saying, "We are all sinners." And there's been more stories about splits that might be emerging within the religious right. And it's a story that we've seen throughout the Republican Party with Donald Trump front and center. So today, to discuss this, we have one of our colleagues here at Princeton, Kevin Kruse, a professor of history. He is the author of the prize-winning book, White Flight, Atlanta and the Making of Modern Conservatism. And more recently, he published One Nation Under God, How Corporate America Invented Christian America. And he has also become the historian, Twitter historian extraordinaire. So welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me.
Can I just start by asking you to just tell us why the religious right has been important to conservative politics, and whether you think it remains a significant part of the party through this election?
Sure. The religious right is something that really came into being in the late 1970s and then gained real national prominence in the 80s and throughout the 90s. And it really forms one of the, if we think of the modern conservative movement as a stool with three legs, kind of libertarians, national security conservatives, and then the social conservatives of the religious right are the third leg there. And they've been an important part of the Republican coalition. Often they've played perhaps a secondary, maybe even a tertiary role behind those other two legs of the stool. But for the most part, it's been a vital component here. And it's important to think about the religious right in two ways. One, to think about what goes on internally in the different groups that make up the religious right. They're really kind of multiple components of the religious right. But also to think about the way in which they work together as a coalition. That moral majority, that is probably the most famous organization of the religious right, was one that formed in the late 1970s. And the concept in the name is, I think, important because it was an effort to put aside theological or doctrinal differences that had so long divided religious conservatives, that had kept Catholic conservatives apart from evangelical conservatives, from Mormons, from Jews, from different groups. And instead, what the moral majority meant, with the name that was embraced by them in 1979, was their belief that out there's a, quote, moral majority that believes in the principles of the Decalogue, that basically believes in the Ten Commandments. And if we can focus people on these kind of basic guiding principles that animate not just evangelicals and fundamentalists, but all Christians, and indeed everyone who would fall under this mid-century concept of the Judeo-Christian tradition, we can unite them and bring them together and make them a powerful political force. And it wasn't just simply a matter of unifying them around a kind of a lowest common denomination religion, but also mobilizing them to the polls. For too long, religious conservatives had absented themselves from national politics. And what you see with the rise of the religious right is a new conviction that not only should they be involved in politics, but they could actually shape things to come.
And have they been relatively united as a political force? And we now see a lot of divisions are emerging over a candidate. But is it true that the religious right has been cohesive through the period you're talking about?
For the most part. I mean, there's been some fracturing, but increasingly, I think if you look at the period that leads up to even the Bush administration, what you see is a growing consensus really driven by two main issues above all else, and those are abortion and homosexuality. And these issues had once, in fact, divided these communities. If you look back when the abortion legalization movement comes about, evangelicals and Protestants are on the other side of Catholics. They see abortion as a Catholic issue, but it increasingly becomes one that unites them. And the struggle over gay rights is another one too. So it really held them together up till about 2008.
And then what happened at that point? Why did they, what happened to those guys?
Well, part of it was that the energy on those issues, Sam, had been spent. And so you have a sense on abortion that every card has been played, short of overturning Roe v. Wade, that there have been significant rollbacks. And so in the run-up to the 2004 election, the Bush administration pushes through a piece of legislation about violence against the unborn and pushes into place a partial birth abortion ban. That was about as far legislatively as they could go. The same token on gay marriage. They pushed this issue with the federal marriage amendment in 2004, and that served to really mobilize voters to the poll. But once those issues have been spent at the state level, especially with these kind of referendum on gay marriage there's really not much else they can do. And at the same time as these issues had run their course, thinking about 30 years of political mobilization and action on these, you also have a generational change taking place in the religious right. And so you start to see more and more a new generation of leaders who are radically different from Jerry Falwell Sr. or from Pat Robertson of the Christian Coalition, which is kind of the major successor group to the moral majority. And they don't care as much about those issues. I mean, they care about abortion. They're less hostile on gay rights, but they start to push back against the assumption that those are the only issues that a Christian should care about in politics. And they start to care much more about the environment, a movement called creature care. They start to care more politically. They had always through charity, but more politically in terms of looking out for poverty. The governor of Alabama runs on a tax hike called the least of these. They start to care more and more about a variety of issues. And we see this today where they are starting to buck the party, the Republican Party, considerably on issues over immigration and Syrian refugees in particular. They see it as a Christian duty to take these people in, regardless of what Republican officials say on the other side.
So if we took the senior ones, though, we step back, the Jerry Falwells and his whole cohort, going into this election before Donald Trump is the nominee, who are these guys, in your opinion? Just who are they politically? Because I'm trying to understand, I think we all are, how they remain loyal. And so can you characterize them a bit?
Well, they remain loyal because they're so fixated on these major issues. And this remains the issue that is keeping the new generation in line, which is the focus on the Supreme Court. So they really see that as the end all and be all. And so they're willing to excuse a large number of personal failings. Again, Ronald Reagan was a divorced, former Hollywood actor who'd signed into law California's abortion liberalization measure. He doesn't stand out as someone who rarely went to church, we should remember. It doesn't strike you as somebody who would naturally be a good fit for the religious right. Yet they rallied around him because he would get results. He could tell them what they wanted to hear, and the thing they wanted to hear most was that he would deliver on the Supreme Court, especially on issues of abortion, also on school prayer, homosexuality. So they firmly believe this, and that's what really kept them in line, was this real desire to win the culture wars at the highest levels of power.
I see. So, for instance, in the case of Donald Trump, he may be a person of what appears to be low character, but he's going to give us what we want. And furthermore, the other side is not going to give us what we want. And so it's a matter of polarization where there's only one candidate that's going to deliver, speaking from the view of a member of the religious right.
Right. For them, and again, from the outside looking in, this seems like a bizarre choice that someone who was, a self-proclaimed leader of the values voter movement would rally around someone like Donald Trump, who even before the revelations on tape or the many accusations against him for sexual harassment and sexual assault, was someone who was a, kind of a serial adulterer, divorced twice, a casino magnate, not someone who really seemed to embody the values they claim to support. But on this issue of the court, that's all that mattered, was that he promised that he would support very conservative appointees to the Supreme Court and the lower federal courts too. And that was all that mattered. And so you had people like Jerry Falwell Jr. rationalizing, well, God has always used flawed candidates. He's always used flawed messengers. He's picked sinners to be his agents before, and this is nothing different. It's an awkward dance given the accusations that they've made constantly about the moral failings of liberal and centrist Democrat leaders. And you'll have to look back to the charge led against Bill Clinton for his sexual affairs and infidelities to see that this is not a standard they've applied uniformly. But in this case, it's all about the Supreme Court, and that's all that seemingly matters to them.
And until now, it seems, and Sam, you might know this too, that he's done relatively well. It hasn't been great. I saw an article that said 65% of white evangelicals are still saying, even now, that they'll support him, which is much lower than Romney, who was a Mormon and got 79%, right. But still higher than you would imagine if you don't follow this. Until now, in the primaries, and at least through this last burst, he's been able to maintain not just the Falwells, the strategic thinkers, but the voters too.
Yeah, it's been remarkable. And that dip is significant, though, I think. I mean, so he still does have a majority of white evangelicals, about 2/3, as Julian noted. But that's a significant drop-off. And I think comparing it to Romney is an important benchmark, because Romney was a Mormon, and a Mormon who was regarded by many evangelicals as a member of a cult because he was a Mormon. And yet even there, 79% supported him. Here we're down into the 60s. And again, that's white evangelicals. I think it's important to distinguish that, because if you look at black and Hispanic evangelicals, they're overwhelmingly in favor of Clinton. It goes the other way. It's about 65-12, I think, going for Clinton over Trump. So there's a real split here in the evangelical bloc.
So getting back to what you were saying about issues like Syrian refugees or, say, tax policies, it makes me think of a piece that I saw by Stephen Prothero, a professor of religion, I think, at Boston University. He wrote a piece for Politico magazine a few months ago taking the position that evangelicals are no longer so much a religious movement anymore, at least when it comes to voting, but more of a political movement where they are political actors rather than religious actors per se. Because if I think about some of the things you said, whether it be extending charity to Syrian refugees or taking care of poor people, I don't know, to me those sound like priorities that could align with Democratic Party priorities.
And they do. And that's why you're starting to see a real shift. And here I think it's important to zoom out and remember that when we talk about the religious right, evangelicals are simply the most prominent part of what had been an important coalition that brought together not just evangelicals, but a variety of other groups, but most significantly Catholics and Mormons. And so if you look at the trends that have taken place with these other two groups, we see a very different model, and one that is not as driven by politics as the evangelicals who are standing by Trump have been. The Mormons have broken sharply their old coalition mates in the religious right, and which is something that's very significant given their concentration in the Mountain West and especially Utah. I mean, there's a chance now that Evan McMullin will either throw the state of Utah perhaps to Clinton or could take it outright for himself. But in any case, Utah, the most reliably red state for about a decade, is now not in the Republican lockbox yet.
Yeah, although as I've said before in a previous episode, I think that the role of McMullin this year, in some ways, the presidential race is semi-over, and somebody like McMullin can save the down ticket races for Republicans, where somebody like Mia Love in the 4th district of Utah could get her bacon saved, as it were, by the presence of McMullin on the ballot. So giving people in this category a reason to go out and vote rather than stay home.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. Yeah.
And this coalition, is it still most important in southern states? Or does the religious right move beyond it?
No, it's most important in southern states. I mean, this is the thing, is that if we think about both the denominational and the geographic span of the religious right as we knew it in the 80s and 90s, it really was one where different faiths mapped out, not perfectly, but largely regionally. And so you had Catholics concentrated in the Northeast and the Midwest. You had Mormons in the Mountain West, and then evangelicals largely through the region we call the Sun Belt, the South and the Southwest. And so they're now the one block that is really locked down here, and it's in that traditional base of the Republican Party in the South.
And then the other thing that's interesting is there's a gender gap. That's what some of the data is saying within the religious right. So the support for the white male evangelicals for Trump is I think it's significantly higher than a more plummeting female evangelical.
That's right. Yeah, but there's been a huge gender gap here. And again, this I think reflects To a large degree, the recent comments that have been, and the accusations about Trump that came to light in the closing stretch of the campaign were pivotal here. But the cracks had already formed, and you started to see a number of prominent women in the religious right drift away. And I think that reflects more of a generational change, is that they were part of the old core of the religious right was one that was solely led by male ministers. And now you're seeing a larger number of lay people who have prominent voices, and a large number of them are women. And so they have moved away from that old rigid lockstep movement of the religious right and are pushing in new directions.
Do you think, can I ask one other thing? One of the things we've talked about a lot, Sam and I, are the ways in which Trump and Trumpism actually comes out of Republican politics and isn't simply an anomaly, and it's not simply a big break. And with some of the Republican Party, I think you can see it more clearly. So Tea Party Republicanism has some of the same rambunctious quality as Donald Trump, or the conservative media, Fox Television has some of the same kind of rhetoric that he uses. Are there connections that we might be missing? We've been talking now about the tensions and the commonalities only through specific issues like the Supreme Court. But would you say, stepping back as a historian, that in fact there are ties, or is he a break from the kind of politics they've been fighting for?
That the religious right's been fighting for? I think it's a little of both. That's a classic historian's answer, right? It's a little of both. In some ways, he's continuing their push on these major issues, on abortion, less so on gay rights, but really on abortion. The issue of gay rights now is not whether or not gay marriage is going to be legal, but whether or not religious conservatives can basically exempt themselves from this, whether their businesses, whether their churches will remain free from what they regard as a sin. So in that, he's still pushing these same old issues, and he's using some of the same old language. A couple of his speeches sound like they came out of the epilogue from my book, One Nation Under God. I mean, he's using some of the exact same quotes. At the same time, the lack of sincerity and the lack of commitment here is, I think, a break. Again, I think it was one thing for the religious right to embrace Reagan, because Reagan at least knew how to play the part. He may not have been a regular churchgoer himself, but he knew how to cast an image here that fit with what they expected. With Trump, it's almost surprisingly a lack of effort even to make this seem like something that he's sincere about. Insisting that the Bible's his favorite book, and then when pressed, he can't name a single verse, calling 2 Corinthians 2 Corinthians. There are a lot of little moments here that would have normally driven members of the religious right screaming and running away. And again, I think it's important to think here that it's not just what Trump brings to the table, but it's actually what has gone on with the opposition here that helps keep them in line. And so it's not just that Trump is an imperfect candidate who they've embraced. It's more that they're almost recoiling from Hillary Clinton, who has been built up in the mind of many evangelicals, white evangelicals on the conservative side, as the end-all and be-all of all that is wrong with the world.
Well, let's see.
Yeah.
So there's a few things going on here. So one is, since Trump is reportedly not really that much of a reader, doesn't he get these things secondhand? I mean, he consumes Breitbart and Fox News and so on. And so he gets these things as if through a game of telephone. So if he doesn't hang around with the evangelicals, then there's a limit to how well he can, he can be familiar with the things that are important to them.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And it's weird if you look at the few times he's gone specific on anything with any precision. The main one is the Johnson Amendment from 1954, which refused to give tax exemptions to churches that engage directly in politics. This has been in the background the entire existence of the religious right, and never was something that they railed against. They found ways to work around it. Falwell and Robertson found ways to work around this. It wasn't a big issue, but someone, and I'm dying to know who, someone has put this bug in his ear that this is the big issue that the religious right cares about. And it's really been kind of amazing, because it's something that was never on the radar before.
I've never seen an amendment, a legislative amendment like this, reach such from a lot decades and decades ago.
Right.
Reach such proportions.
Let me come back to Hillary Clinton for a second here. So you said that there's this antipathy in this sector against Hillary Clinton, but just to stop and think about her as something that seems to be really ingrained in her, she seems like people have said that she's a real hardcore Methodist, that a lot of things about her can just be really understood by her approach to life that she perhaps learned when she was very young. So is there tension? Is it Is the relationship between evangelicals and Methodists neutral, tense? Talk about that.
The relationship between those groups was one that was tense, and historically speaking. I mean, the evangelical movement forms politically, if we want to root it in the National Association of Evangelicals, it forms in the 1940s, and it forms specifically in hostile reaction to the kind of liberal to moderate politics of mainline Protestant churches. And the Methodist Church would have been right out front on that. So there has always been this tension here. But I think if we do look closely at Clinton, and we saw this in full effect in the Democratic National Convention, and also a little bit in the first debate, Clinton is somebody who wears her Methodism on her sleeve. She had a prominent moment in the convention where she basically defined her approach to politics as one motivated by the Methodist beliefs of John Wesley, that you should do all the good you can. It's essentially, she's embodying an old school of thought known as the social gospel, that the duty of good Christians was to effect positive change on earth, to take care of the poor, to take care of the needy, to take care of immigrants, to take care of the sick, the suffering, that was a goal. And this is something that we've forgotten in our politics, but really animated the left back in the 1930s. Not the entire left. There were certainly secular and atheist voices there. But if you look at what Roosevelt did with the New Deal, it is suffused with religious language of the social gospel. And it is backed by the major churches at the time, the Federal Council of Churches, the head of this group, the main organization of mainline Protestant churches, says, look, the New Deal is just doing what we've been advocating all along. It's talking about the importance of shelter and housing and daily bread. So the New Deal is just really the Christian thing to do, they argue. And so there was a real trend in mainstream democratic liberalism in the 30s and 40s that spoke to these religious values. And the party got away from that for decades as religion seemed to be increasingly the province of the right. But I think what you're seeing with Clinton and with Tim Kaine, I think importantly, is a revival of that old politics of the social gospel.
That was also true with the civil rights movement in the 1960s. It was, the rhetoric was religious, the leaders were religious, right. Many of the followers were motivated by religious thought. And then I remember in 2008, there was an effort from some Obama supporters, I can't even remember the specific people, but religious figures who were trying to get back to those traditions. And yet it hasn't worked. And I assume it's still a struggle for Hillary Clinton. Why is it so difficult to make the kind of argument that you're making, or to go back to that older style? Is it the party has changed? Is it that the religious community or the leaders have changed? Is it different? Is there part of the religious world that's just not interested in politics as interested as the conservatives are?
I think to some degree it's a little bit of all of those. I mean, if we want to look at, I think the most important one, it's that the demographics of the Democratic Party have changed. So you still have large numbers of people who would identify themselves as belonging to a particular faith, but you've got an increasingly large block that identifies itself either as secular, as atheist, or agnostic. And as that becomes an increasingly big chunk, I think about a fifth of Democratic voters would fall into one of those categories, then it becomes really hard for someone like Clinton to navigate this religious terrain. So for someone on the right, you simply assume all your voters are, to one degree or another, religious, and you simply have to find a way to find a middle ground that doesn't alienate any of their faiths. And that's, again, this kind of watered down one-size-fits-all faith is a way to do that. And so this is why Trump talks about we'll be, one nation saluting one God under one flag. It's an easy way to unify. If you're on the Democratic side and you're trying to straddle that line between believers and non-believers, it's a much harder dance to pull off. You can't embrace the religious rhetoric too much, or you risk alienating the people who identify as nuns, so-called N-O-N-E-S, but they have no particular faith. You can't embrace the secular side. Then you wind up looking like Mike Dukakis in 1988, really the only truly secular candidate I think we've ever had. And then you drive away the people who are animated by faith. So it's a much harder task, I think, for any Democrat at this moment to walk that line. And we saw this during the Obama presidency. He made an announcement in one of his major speeches about, we're believers and non-believers. And the simple fact that atheists and agnostics got a shout out as a possible category was kind of amazing there. But that's about as far as they can go. It's a line that's very delicate for them to walk.
So where does this leave a movement that is working towards progressive ideals like the Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina, given the diversity and range of faith and non-faith in the Democratic coalition. How is there some way that can get patched up?
Well, I think the Moral Mondays movement is a great example. So Reverend William Barber there, obviously animated by his faith, obviously has a lot of supporters there who do that. But the organizations that back him, from the NAACP and on, include large numbers of people who don't consider themselves that way. And so Barber himself is hearkening back to that tradition that Julian mentioned in the civil rights movement of using often religious language to justify their claims. But more importantly, underneath that, it's a rights-based argument. It's not, pointing first to the Bible. It's really pointing first to the Constitution. And so that's something that all supporters, religious or irreligious, I think can get behind. And that's a way in which they can create kind of a broad constituency. His visible role as a religious leader naturally attracts people who otherwise might have written the group off as something like radical. It's reassuring in the same way the ministers that headed the marches in the 60s were reassuring to people who otherwise were that this was a radical cause. But the language is one that focuses largely on rights. And if you ever listen to Barber talk, he's incredibly well versed in history too. He's got a great sense of where this country has been and where it is now and where it should be. But it's one where the through line is one based on the Constitution and not on the Bible.
And is Donald Trump, I think I know what you're going to say, but is this purely a cynical move, his appeal to them? How do you read Trump and from his perspective?
Purely a cynical move. It is, again, Trump constantly reminds me of George Wallace, and in a lot of senses that he's kind of balances this white nationalism with economic populism, et cetera, et cetera. But it's the plasticity of his ideology, the way in which he could convince himself to believe anything. And so you've seen Trump, who was once outspokenly pro-choice, outspokenly in favor of LGBT rights, has now reversed course on this. Trump, who never had much of a religious appeal at all, who his church was probably the Howard Stern show, is now insisting that he is in lockstep with religious leaders. And again, this is just like Wallace. One of Wallace's close advisors said he doesn't believe anything. You could have parachuted him into Albania, and within a week he would have been head of the local communist collective. And in a year he would have been down at the Comintern. He would have been a firm believer in whatever kept him in power.
Well, I can't.
A lot what we see here.
I can't shake this feeling that's bothering me a little bit. I've often heard about this idea about the three-legged stool that supports the Republican Party, and I have this little feeling that we're putting something new into an old container. That Trumpism is not something that fits easily into this idea of the religious right. And I almost think, as I hear you describe the decline of religion in U.S. life, that there's some new principle that's animating this pretty organized faction, this group of 30-40% of the Republican Party. So that's about 1 out of 9, say 1 out of 9-ish U.S. voters who really liked him, and they liked him more than they liked anybody else around. And I almost wonder whether these issues of race or perhaps economics, that there's something else that correlates with being a member of the religious right, but isn't quite that. And I'm trying to figure out whether it's time to reevaluate what the cohesive group is.
I think it's absolutely in a state of flux here. And it has been for the last, really, I think since 2008, we've seen a new era in what's going on with these groups. And it's a generational crack up. It's a denominational crack up. Unfortunately, as an historian, my training is in hindsight. It's to look ahead, but I'm looking forward to getting my hands on the data from this election and seeing just where we might go from here.
Let me ask one question as we wrap this up. The New York Times article I mentioned earlier quotes Mark DeMoss, who was chief of staff for Falwell in the past. And DeMoss says the evangelical movement has, in my view, forfeited any future moral authority in American public life because of leaders coming out in favor of Trump. How do you see that quote?
I think he's absolutely right. If you're going to look at people like Jerry Falwell Jr., Tony Perkins, head of the Nominal Value Voters Summit, I do think they're going to not have much support. You only have to look at what's happening at Liberty University, where Jerry Falwell Jr.'s own students are almost in open revolt. And at a place like Liberty University, that's shocking. So you had the administration interfering in a student editorial in the student paper. You had a petition, which included thousands of students past and present who were upset with Falwell's endorsement and embrace of Trump. So I think people like those are going to find themselves on the out. The evangelical community's power, though, might still be alive and well. And I think it's going to be with the folks in the evangelical movement who made it clear that they were early markers of the Never Trump campaign. So someone like Russell Moore at the Southern Baptist Convention, who for the last few years has been engaged in a kind of deep soul searching with what the SBC did on past issues of racism and the civil rights movement, has led a reconciliation on that, but made it very clear from the start that he wanted nothing to do with Donald Trump. And so if this election is one in which Trump and Trumpism seems to be widely rejected, not just by evangelicals, by the country as a whole, they're going to realize that's not a path to power anymore. And people like Falwell and Perkins won't be trusted as much. But I think someone like Russell Moore might well be.
See, even historians can make predictions. So thanks again to Kevin Kruse for joining us, professor of history here at Princeton University, author most recently of One Nation Under God, How Corporate America Invented Christian America, published by Basic Books, available in online bookstores, real actual bookstores, and everywhere else. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, guys.
That wraps up our episode. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back soon on Politics and Polls.
Take care of everybody.
You've been listening to Politics and Polls, a podcast series about the 2016 presidential election produced by WooCast. The content discussed in this podcast is intended to be informational only. It does not represent nor reflect the views of Princeton University or the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs.